Welcome to the official Lawyer Minds podcast. Lawyer Minds is an ever-growing ecosystem for all the resources modern lawyers need. As the official Lawyer Minds podcast, we'll discuss everything from the latest happenings on the website to industry news. Get ready. Here we go. It's time to dive into the minds of successful lawyers. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Mike Campbell.
Hey, Mike. Good to see you, man.
Dad. How's it going, buddy?
I'm hanging in. Hey, do you want the good news or the bad news?
You know what? I'm going to go good news.
Everybody always chooses good news first. People don't want to hear the bad news.
No.
All right, here's the good news. The good news is after podcast number 1, Ryan did not fire us as the talent for this. If you're already listening, I did quotes for talent. He did not fire us after podcast number 1.
I love it. Okay, that's the good news. Tell me what the bad news is.
The bad news is it only took us 2 podcasts to get to talking about bourbon. And because we're talking about bourbon, I have to drink bourbon during this podcast. We might get fired after podcast number 2.
So when we do the wrap, we're getting to a place of slurred words. Ryan may say, enough of these shenanigans.
You know, I think that's why Ryan was smart enough to say, hey, why don't you both host? That way, if I get so drunk during the podcast that I can't finish, you just cover for me.
I'm not going to lie. He might have actually mentioned that beforehand because your voice could carry the podcast alone. I'm just a guy that just, is filling in. But Brian and I did have this conversation that, hey, Tad tends to drink a lot of bourbon. So if you could help him out, carry it a little bit, he's going to get most of it across the finish line. So,
well, and fortunately, my bad habits have led us to this podcast number 2, which I think is going to be incredibly interesting. And that is an interview with Brian Haara, who wrote Bourbon Justice, which you and I have both read.
I'd not heard of the book. And then we were talking about it and you guys had mentioned it and I've now read it twice. It's fascinating, filled with great historical characters, total, American history, and not just that, but American legal history. So if you're a lawyer and you're a lawyer who likes to drink bourbon, which I've heard that a few lawyers do, this is going to be the podcast for you.
That's not true. You heard incorrectly, Mike, because none of my friends who hopefully are listening to this podcast, A, drink bourbon, or B, smoke cigars, and certainly none of them do it at the same time.
I must have been completely mistaken. And I think I mentioned to you before,
Fake news.
So the only reason why I am smoking cigars on a regular basis is to get that nice raspy radio voice to try to keep up with your, melodic Kentucky Southern deep voice.
I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate you trying to mimic me.
No problem. Flattery.
Unless you're making fun of me, and I just can't pick up on it.
I think that this podcast, as long as, you can sort of stay sober enough all the way through the whole thing, we might go somewhere, kid.
Yeah, I'm going to try.
Okay.
So we're going to interview Brian. I never had a clue until I read the book about the role that bourbon actually plays in the legal framework of our country. It's amazing. It's an amazing history.
And he writes in the book that, bourbon litigation is what gave rise to things like the Pure Food and Drug Act, trademark litigation, some class action litigation. And it's incredible to think that, in order to get pure food and drug regulations, you have to rely upon these cases involving bourbon distilleries and not like clean milk or clean meat. It's let's make sure the bourbon's good. Let's make sure the bourbon's pure.
We got our priorities, especially
we got to have our priorities. Yeah.
I had no idea. He writes in his book, he said, let me find it here. Ultimately, this is a quote, ultimately consumers were protected from bad whiskey before they were protected from tainted food, dangerous products, and misleading advertising.
We got to have our priorities in this country.
Yeah. And then he takes that statement, and then, he's got chapters and chapters of why that statement is true.
And it's totally true, because when you see the historical characters at play here, which are like Colonel E.H. Taylor, James Pepper, James Crow, I mean, these guys were, for lack of a better phrase, rascals.
Yeah.
And old time. I'm going old timey on this one, brother.
Right.
The rascals. And so guys like Taft, whenever he was on the Sixth Circuit and then became president, said, we got to start making sure that these guys are doing the right thing. And then also, it's things you would never expect that bourbon litigation would result in, which, you're in Kentucky. There's this case out of Kentucky about how judges who are biased shouldn't hear certain types of cases. And that came from bourbon litigation. And then also about what, you can use on your brands and trademarks. And it's incredible to me that the history of bourbon litigation is so profound, had such an amazing impact on our legal history.
And it's not only, we talk about it coming from Kentucky, because, as I like to say, 90% of all bourbon comes from Kentucky and the other 10% is counterfeit. Brian's going to talk to us about why that's not really true.
Right.
But, it's international. There's actually a definition of bourbon in NAFTA and other treaties that the United States has with foreign countries.
Yep. And what's incredible is that, so when he's talking about some of these cases, one of them was this Maker Mark's case, right? Where Maker's Mark has this trademark red wax that's dripping down the bottle. And this tequila company decided, you know what, we're going to also use some red wax that's dripping down the bottle. And Maker's Mark filed suit against them. Tequila company wasn't in this country. And the court said, yeah, this belongs to Maker's Mark. And the defendant's argument in that case, which I love, has since been turned on its head. And it's, hey, you don't have to worry about our red wax getting confused with their red wax, because the people who purchase our tequila are too refined for bourbon. And you just sort of look at when that case, was heard, and now you think about what bourbon is. It's totally turned it on its head, because it's sort of like the refined drink of the landed gentry, I guess, is for lack of a better phrase.
Well, let's hear from Brian about the book, Bourbon Justice. Hey, good afternoon, Brian Haara, attorney from Louisville, Kentucky. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Brian, we're going to talk about your book here in a minute, but why don't you tell me a little about your practice? You work with Tackall Meek here in Louisville. What do you do?
That's right. I do all business litigation. I dabble a little bit in distillery litigation, which is nice with my interest here. So a little bit of distillery trademark law, a little bit of employment, environmental, those sorts of things, all of the things that distilleries run into.
In honor of a bourbon book, I felt it was appropriate to drink bourbon while I do this interview. If the interview goes too long, though, Mike's going to have to jump in and do all the questions, because I'm working on an empty stomach. Okay.
I'll be fine. I am unlike my fellow Missourian, Harry Truman, who apparently drink a shot of bourbon every morning. Is that true, Brian?
That's what they say. It's true. I mean, that's one heck of a way to wake up in the morning.
And so I think Tad's mentor is Harry Truman. Apparently, he's gonna go for it today.
We have a lot in common. Brian, so your book is called Bourbon Justice. What motivated you to write a book on the law of bourbon?
Well, it was almost by accident. When you're from Kentucky, you've been on the Woodford Reserve tour probably a half dozen times. And I was there maybe on my fifth or sixth tour, just one random July in 2013. And it's the same story that you hear when you're on tour there. It's a beautiful setting, beautiful grounds. You can tell it's old. They talk about how old it is. And then I get back to the office on a Monday and I'm researching something totally unrelated to bourbon. and I ran across a case from the 1800s that, as I see, it has to do with bourbon, and I'm a bourbon fan, so I start reading it. And I can tell it's about the place that I just was the weekend before that. And they're talking about E.H. Taylor, which is a name I knew but didn't know had anything to do with what's Woodford Reserve now. They were talking about James Pepper, which wasn't a name I knew in 2013, and it wasn't anything I knew that had to do with Woodford Reserve. So as I read it more and realized the even more significant history that was at that site than they had talked about at the tour, I wondered, why weren't they talking about this other history? And I started looking at other cases, and I found a different story out there for the origin story of Maker's Mark. I found out a lot more about Pepper. I found out about E.H. Taylor fighting with George T. Stagg. And I realized there's a lot of information out there that people don't know about, that's hidden in these lawsuits. And that's really what drove me to start sharing that a little bit. And then Fred Minnick, who wrote my foreword, suggested that there was enough material to put into a book. And I never would have guessed that I'd be an author, but it ended up working its way into a book.
You know, being lawyers, we deal with published cases all the time. One of the things that I never really considered until I read your book was how valuable the source material can be from a filed case.
Well, and I don't know that that's going to be true across the board, but for bourbon, it absolutely is, because during Prohibition, especially, it wasn't good to have distilleries or distillers in your family background. You threw away those things. You didn't know that it would be repealed. And your distillers in your background tended to be the black sheep of the family. So you didn't talk about it. You lost your oral history, you lost your written history. And it was a time in the country where papers like that weren't going to be saved. So those were all unwittingly, I think, preserved in these old lawsuits. So Frankfort, Kentucky is our capital, and they have an archives for the circuit court. And I went there and I found deposition transcripts. I found exhibits that were used in depositions. I found trial exhibits. I found all this original source material that told these stories that I think had been lost to history otherwise.
It sounds like you read a bunch of depositions. We talked about, Stagg and E.H. Taylor. Did you get a sense of who these guys were? Because they seemed very interesting.
They were incredibly interesting. I mean, it's a time period when the American capitalist, I think, is really coming into his own. And people like Pepper and Stagg were definitely those folks. And right now, I can't tell you that I would have liked or disliked E.H. Taylor. He's by all accounts, he's a great man. He's venerated today. He's legendary today. But he did a lot of people wrong. I mean, he tried to sell the same, or actually did sell the same barrels a couple of times to different people, and he got sued over that. He stiffed all of his creditors. He skipped town so that his creditors couldn't come after him. But he made his fortune, and he lost it a couple of times and kept making it back. So he was a real interesting guy. And then Bill Sr. from Maker's Mark fame, really interesting as well. He's a Army veteran. He left. That's why they weren't distilling during World War II. And he came back and he wanted to have his own brand. And you get the sense of the drive that these people have to create the absolute best whiskey that they can. And that's something that I think the marketers now today still latch on to. Everyone claims to have the best and use the best ingredients and have the best methods. And that's something that these guys were trying to do back in the 1800s as well.
And back in the 1800s, there was a problem with the quality of bourbon. And as your book points out, that's how we got some of our first consumer protection laws.
Yeah, that's right. That surprised me as well, too. I mean, we've all heard stories, I'm sure, or you had to read excerpts from The Jungle that you might remember from school, where processed meat and milk and candy and all sorts of things in the 1800s could be really dangerous. There were all sorts of additives in milk, some of it really bad, like they would put formaldehyde in milk to try to preserve it longer. They would also water it down, but then they had to thicken it up. So they would add chalk and they would add other things to thicken it back up. And sometimes they even watered it down with pond water. So you were introducing really bad things into your milk. There weren't any consumer protection laws for that. With meat, they did the same thing. You didn't know when you got ground beef or any kind of sausage. That's where the saying comes from. Seeing how the sausage is made. They put all kinds of things in there, and there was no consumer protection for it. Consumer protection didn't come along until E.H. Taylor wanted to get rid of the rectifiers. The rectifiers were the folks who maybe had a little bit of whiskey in their product, but really it was a neutral grain spirit, a high proof vodka. And then they would add things to give it the look and feel and taste and aroma of whiskey. And they could make what they called bourbon for you in a couple of days, whereas it took 6 years before folks like E.H. Taylor were selling their straight bourbon whiskey. So he was the one who took the initiative and got a hold of politicians, convinced the nation to have a new consumer protection law, and that's the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And it's the first Consumer Protection Act, and that it absolutely floored me that the nation decided to protect us from bad whiskey before it protected us from anything else.
Bad whiskey
and I
before
think
bad food.
That's right.
And it wasn't just Taylor going after the rectifiers. It was some of the shenanigans that Taylor and Pepper were engaged in that caused President, then Judge Taft, to really give a hard look at, how we were going to define what whiskey is and what whiskey is now.
That's exactly right. So President Taft, when he was on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, had a case where James Pepper was involved in. And he was trying to sue a bottler who was still using his label after he had his own bottling operation at his distillery. And what Taft really got into, and this is something that the rectifiers argued too, he got into what it means to be pure, because everyone wanted to have pure on their label. They were arguing they were pure. The rectifiers were saying they were purer than whiskey because they took all these steps to make it safer, which straight bourbon people didn't believe. But Pepper was playing fast and loose with his labels because he was saying it was pure and it was all 100% from his distillery. And it just wasn't. He was getting whiskey from 3 different distilleries, putting it into his bottle, putting his label on it with guarantees at about 4 different places on the label. And Taft took that to heart. And when he ended up giving his Taft decision, one of his main points was that the consumer is entitled to know what's in the bottle. And as long as the consumer knows what's in the bottle, then then we'll be all right. Let's label straight whiskey. Let's if it's not straight whiskey, people are entitled to know that. But follow what's on your label with what's in the bottle.
So with the Bottled and Bond Act, from there on, the things that were on the label actually had definitions, and some of them actually became had a legal definition, right?
Sure. The things. So Bottle and Bond was the first real label other than straight bourbon whiskey. That was a term that was already used. But Bottled in Bond had to come from a single distillery out of a single distillation season, which there's two distillation seasons, fall and spring. Had to come from one distillery, had to be exactly 100 proof, and it couldn't have any additives other than pure water to proof it down if it was higher than 100 proof. And having that kind of guarantee of purity led the marketers within the bourbon world to create new names, new things that they thought would sell for the consumers. So they came up with single barrels and small batch and craft and all these sorts of things that are used today, handmade, things like that, to evoke that it's made in the old way or made in a small way. And through that, they get a lot more purchasers, because you don't want whiskey from a factory. You want whiskey from some bucolic distillery in the hills of Kentucky.
And I think what's fascinating is we actually just did an interview with someone about changing their brand name of their firm, and how bourbon specifically gave rise to the phrase brand name. And there were a couple cases on point about how these distillers could use brand names. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's fascinating that others are using that, especially lawyers. But the phrase brand name, something that we've used, and maybe it's one of those things we don't know where it even comes from. But it comes from the time before whiskey was bottled. Before it was bottled, it was sold to your favorite tavern by the barrel. And so Old Crow, for example, one of the most famous brands in the mid 1800s and late 1800s, would be sold by the barrel to the tavern. The tavern owner would have it behind the bar, and people would ask for it by the name that was burned onto the barrel head, because that's what was facing the room. And federal regulations at the time required the distiller to burn his name onto the barrel. And that's how it got there. And it became known because it was burned with a brand as the brand name. Some brands actually came about because of an error in the branding iron. There's one from Louisville that's a distillery known as the Melwood Distillery, and it's long gone now. But when the guy started it, he called it the Millwood, M-I-L-L Wood Distillery. He ordered his brand. It came back Melwood, and it was too expensive to make a new brand, so he changed his distillery name, and it became a really famous brand out of Louisville, and there's a street named after it now, and there's a few foundations left in the area, but that's all because a brand was required. A branding iron was required. And that's what people referred to as the whiskey. It's sort of the first brand name out there, first thing you asked for by the brand name.
So, we got all kinds of really cool stories in your book about these different characters. Are you going to work on another book?
I think I am. And I think it's got to be E.H. Taylor. I mean, he has the most lawsuits and the most stories, if I'm going to continue to use old lawsuits and old transcripts as my source material. He had 13 years of litigation with George T. Stagg, which is one of the more famous limited edition brands that we have now. And they're both made at Buffalo Trace now. But he hated Stagg, and Stagg hated him. And there's great stories about their lawsuit. He had another 10-year legal battle with another Colonel Taylor, a guy named Marion Taylor out of Louisville, who was a rectifier. So, of course, they had battles. And so there's stories to tell there. There's stories to tell how he started the Old Taylor Distillery after he split ways with Stagg. And that's really where he became legendary. But what I've found, and this didn't make it into Bourbon Justice, it wasn't all smooth sailing after that. He actually lost everything again. And he had banks suing him, and he had his old distiller suing him, who he didn't pay. And so he has a lot more ups and downs after the Old Taylor Distillery started. But it really became the most famous brand. And it was really just pushed by him. I mean, he moved mountains all on his own. And that's something that really interests me, how one guy could have such an influence on the entire industry.
I think one of the things that I've tried to figure out, Brian, is whether or not this guy was your classic American con artist or your classic American businessman. Where do you come down on that?
I think probably classic businessman, but he definitely pulled some cons too. I mean, when I mentioned earlier selling the same barrels twice, that's what he did to try to, rob Peter to pay Paul. It was that sort of thing. He was on a downward spiral because of some economic conditions in the country at the time with the grain market and some financial market panics. And so he would look you straight in the eye and sell you barrels that he knew belonged to somebody else. And when he got sued over it, he would skip town and send his son to deal with the creditors. So he definitely had his faults. And when people talk about E.H. Taylor now, it's all good. I mean, they look past what the balance of his personality was and what the rest of his history was. And they'll bring up his childhood. They'll say he was raised by his uncle Zachary Taylor. And that's not really true either. I mean, he spent some time down there after his father died, but there's no record that it was actually with Zachary Taylor or that he reared him at all. And then they fast forward to all of his success. Well, there's a lot between there. He had a lot of business deals go bad between there. His father was a slave trader. No one talks about that. And I think for a fair historical account of him, you have to look at those sorts of things. And I think that's where I'll head next.
I think it sounds like a great book. I loved reading Bourbon Justice. Can you kind of tell everybody where you can find it?
Yeah, you can find it a couple different places. I've got a website you can find by going to bourbonjustice.com, and I have a couple of links there. One of the links there will be to Potomac. That's my publisher. They're part of University of Nebraska Press. Really thankful for them to get back into the bourbon writing market. Their first bourbon book was a little book called Whiskey Women by Fred Minnick. And that's probably the book that started a resurgence of interest in bourbon books. So I'm thankful for them to help starting that trend and then to get back into bourbon with me. So there's a link to Potomac. You can buy it direct from Potomac. It's always on sale at Amazon too. And I've got an Amazon link at bourbonjustice.com, and you'll be able to find that. And then for anyone who's not in Louisville, I've also got a couple boxes of books, and so I can sign them, inscribe them to you, and you can find instructions for that on bourbonjustice.com too.
Sounds great. But if we go through Potomac, our listeners might be able to get a little discount, right?
That's right. So it ends at the end of the month. So it's, I guess, the 18th now. So we have a couple of weeks left. There will be a link and a discount code in the show notes where Potomac has agreed to give a 50% discount. So that's only through the direct Potomac purchase, but 50% is something special. So I appreciate Potomac for doing that as well.
Absolutely. Brian, thank you so much. I thought it was a really amazing book, and I can't wait for your next one.
Well, I appreciate the interest, guys, and I'm always happy to talk about it.
You got it, Brian. You got it. And we'll include all the links in the show notes that you described so people can get out there and take a look at this book.
Sounds great. I appreciate that too.
Mike, I don't know about you. I thought that was really interesting, and I really can't wait until his next book when he starts writing about all these characters in the bourbon industry.
It's amazing. I mean, they're classic American stories. And I want to, tip my hat to you, Tad. You're still with us.
For now.
For now. Okay.
Depends on how much longer we last.
And we are not taping this at 9 a.m. in the morning.
No, we are not. But we're not going to tell everybody what day of the week or what time we're taping this.
That's right. You just didn't have breakfast.
Everybody assume this is Friday afternoon at 6 p.m.
That's right.
So we've got 10 signed copies of Bourbon Justice that we're going to give away. Mike, why don't you tell everybody how to get those?
All right. We've got a deal for you. Great book. Again, if you like bourbon, don't like bourbon, but you love American legal history, don't love American legal history, you're going to really like this book, even if you fall into one of those categories, because it's just an outstanding book. Go on, nominate yourself for an interview. Don't worry about, thinking, I can't nominate myself for this. Do it. Nominate yourself for an interview with Lawyer Minds. You go to lawyerminds.com. Nominate yourself for an interview there, and we're going to give out 10 books in the next 2 weeks to people who nominate themselves. What do you want to do, Tad? You want to say first 10, or you want to draw their names out of a hat?
Let's say first 10. First 10 will get you an autographed book from Brian on Bourbon Justice.
So when you see this podcast or listen to the podcast, then you got to go to lawyerminds.com. Nominate yourself for an interview, and hopefully you're within the first 10. We'll get you an autographed signed copy. And these interviews range the gamut, right? You say you interviewed, Mike. What are you going to interview me on? Because I want a free book, and I want you guys to send me a free book. But when you say interview, what am I going to be interviewed on? Right. We're going to ask you some, I guess, softball questions, but questions that lawyers like me and lawyers like you want to know the answers to. We've all got experiences that we're bringing to this profession, and we want to hear from you about your experiences. So they go all the way from Rini talking about her struggles with depression and anxiety and being brutally honest with us about that, all the way to Jay, who was published an interview about changing the brand name of his firm. And so, we want to hear from you about your experiences. And if you're so honest with us as Rini was, we greatly appreciate it.
And I'll give you another example. I did a telephone interview with somebody today, John Bay from Atlanta, and he talked about, I guess it was 7-8 years ago, he and I went through a leadership academy together, and both of us were solos back then. And now John was telling me he's got 45 people total between lawyers and staff members, just, in 7 years. And he talked about managing that growth, but the flip side to that is, we were both solo practitioners for so long, and you're a solo now. Being a solo has all sorts of other issues associated with it. And, we want to be able to communicate to people from, or lawyers that have solo practices or have large practices, have growing practices. How do you manage those offices?
Right. And it's one of those things where sometimes you think you're out on an island by yourself and that no one else is experiencing what you're experiencing or is going through what you're going through. And I guarantee you that's not the case. And I think if you go on and you read the interviews, you're going to see that we're a lot alike and we're more similar than we're dissimilar. And so what we need is for people to contribute and to offer their experiences, and you won't believe how it might influence or touch someone out there who's going through the same thing that you've gone through in building your firm and some struggle that you have. And it's really powerful stuff.
And I'll just refer everybody back to podcast number 1, which was way back in history.
Yeah,
2 weeks
so far back, ancient history.
That there's also organizations out there like AAJ. And in our first podcast, we talked about Amped Up, which is coming up in July. Those are places that you can go to get that kind of information, that kind of camaraderie. It's listen to the podcast, volunteer to do interviews, join organizations like AAJ and MATA, the Missouri Trial Lawyers, Missouri Association for Justice, or Kentucky Association for Justice.
That's right.
You're never on an island by yourself. It's just a matter of finding the people that are on that same island with you.
That's right. And, for me as a guy who, when you first started practicing, I just kept saying, if only I had a mentor to just kind of guide me through it. And all of a sudden I realized I don't just have one mentor. I have a handful. I have a dozen. And it's from connecting with people in these organizations that you just described. And then also through what we're trying to do here at Lawyer Minds.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll get on and volunteer to be interviewed, and we'll send you questions. And even if the questions that we send you aren't up your alley, there's probably some information that you have that you feel like would be good to get out to other lawyers. And so we want you to volunteer for that. And so the first 10 people over the next 2 weeks will get an autographed copy of Brian's book, Bourbon Justice.
Great. Looking forward to the next one, Tad. If Ryan lets us anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think I did all right this time.
You did. You did all right.
Yeah. We only went through a couple of glasses during this podcast.
Perfect.
All right. Look forward to seeing you next time, Mike.
See you, Dad.
That wraps another episode of the official Lawyer Minds podcast. Please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Explore the other content Lawyer Minds has to offer and engage with us on social media. Your feedback on the show and ideas for future shows is always welcomed. See you next time. That wraps another episode of the official Lawyer Minds podcast. Please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Explore the other content Lawyer Minds has to offer and engage with us on social media. Your feedback on the show and ideas for future shows is always welcomed. See you next time.